May 23, 1945. 15 days after Nazi Germany's unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. But for 412 German women trapped inside a cargo ship crossing the Gulf of Mexico, the terror was just beginning. These women were convinced they had exactly 48 hours left to live. Not because of disease, not because of starvation, but because of something they had learned in Berlin cinemas before the war destroyed everything. American cowboys do not take prisoners. American cowboys shoot first. And the ship was heading straight for Texas. This is not fiction. This is documented history from the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. 412 female prisoners of war. Average age 24. Former telephone operators, signal workers, communication technicians for the Wehrmacht. Women who had never fired a weapon in combat. Women whose only crime was being conscripted into a dying regime's desperate final months. What happened to them over the next 6 months would challenge everything historians thought they knew about prisoner treatment in World War II. What happened would reduce hardened soldiers to uncontrollable weeping. And it would start with something as simple as hot water. But first you need to understand why these women feared cowboys more than they feared death itself. Nazi propaganda had spent 12 years painting Americans as savages. Subhuman brutes with no culture, no civilization, no mercy. The Ministry of Propaganda had weaponized Hollywood's own Western films, pointing to gunfights and frontier justice as proof that Americans were lawless barbarians who executed enemies without trial. These 412 women had internalized every word. Margareta Schmidt was 26 years old. Before the war, she had dreamed of becoming a schoolteacher in her small town outside Berlin. She had a mother in Cologne. She had hopes, plans, a future mapped out in her imagination. Then 1939 happened, 1939. Then 1940. Then 1941. 1942, 1943, 1944. Each year stripped away another piece of that future until nothing remained except survival. By April 1945, Margareta was working in a Wehrmacht communications bunker when Allied bombs turned the building above her into rubble. She spent 3 days trapped underground with dying colleagues before rescue came. 2 weeks later, American soldiers captured her unit. 3 weeks after that, she was on a ship bound for Texas. She had not bathed properly in 2 months. She had not eaten a full meal in 6 weeks. She had not slept without nightmares in longer than she could remember. And now she stood at a grimy porthole watching the coastline of cowboy country emerge through the morning haze. "Will they shoot us immediately?" Elsa Hartman whispered beside her. "Or will they make us dig our own graves first?" Elsa was 24. Former telephone operator from Hamburg. Her fiancé Hans had frozen to death at Stalingrad in February 1942. She had carried his photograph through every bombing raid, every evacuation, every desperate retreat. The photo had finally disintegrated into pulp somewhere in Belgium. She had nothing left. No home. Hamburg had been firebombed into ash. No family. Her parents were missing, presumed dead. No hope. She fully expected to die in Texas within the week. This was the psychological state of every woman on that ship. Absolute certainty of imminent death. Complete acceptance that their captors would show no mercy. Total belief in propaganda they had absorbed since childhood. The port of Houston materialized at 1400 hours on May 23rd. The gangplank lowered. Margareta forced her legs to move, descending onto American soil for the first time, scanning frantically for the execution squad. She saw something impossible instead. A woman in American military uniform stepped forward. Captain Eleanor Morrison, Women's Army Corps, 32 years old, from Connecticut. Behind her stood 24 female soldiers. Not cowboys. Not executioners. Women. Margareta's brain could not process this information. Where were the men with guns? Where was the frontier justice? "Welcome to Texas," Captain Morrison said in accented but comprehensible German. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated with dignity. Dignity. The word meant nothing to women who had been sleeping on wooden planks for weeks, who wore uniforms so filthy the original color was unrecognizable, who smelled like death because everyone around them smelled the same. Military trucks transported them inland. Camp Segoville appeared at dusk. White buildings, wire fencing, guard towers. Margaretta's heart rate spiked. This was it. Whatever happened next would determine whether she lived or died. What happened next demolished 12 years of Nazi propaganda in approximately 90 minutes. The prisoners were led to a building on the camp's eastern edge. Steam rose from roof vents. Margaretta's imagination produced horrors. Gas chambers, scalding punishment, torture facilities designed to extract confessions. 20 at a time, Captain Morrison instructed. You will be given soap, shampoo, and clean towels. The water is hot. Take as much time as you need. Hot water. The words did not register. German prisoners had been surviving on cold streams and rain collection for months. Hot water was a memory from a previous life. Elizabeth Krauss stepped under the first shower head. She was 41, the oldest prisoner in the transport. Former schoolteacher from Dresden. She had witnessed the February 13th firebombing that killed 25,000 people in a single night. She had walked through streets filled with charred corpses. She had taught children who were now ashes. Elizabeth turned the knob expecting punishment. Steam erupted instead. Clean hot water cascaded over skin that had not been properly washed since March. Weeks of accumulated grime began sliding toward the drain. Elizabeth's knees buckled. The sob that escaped her throat was not voluntary. It came from somewhere deeper than conscious control, somewhere that had been locked tight for months, possibly years. The sound triggered a chain reaction. Within 60 seconds, the entire shower house filled with weeping. Margaretta stood under her own shower, watching brown water swirl at her feet, and found herself crying so hard she could barely breathe. She had promised herself she would show no weakness. She had survived bombing raids without tears. She had buried friends without breaking down. But hot water and soap accomplished what trauma could not. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan, a 28-year-old nurse from Boston, moved through the steam checking on prisoners. She had served in field hospitals in France. She had seen men die screaming on operating tables. She thought nothing could surprise her anymore. She was wrong. These women are crying because we gave them soap, she said to Private Linda Torres, a 20-year-old Californian guard. How bad were things in Germany that soap causes this reaction? The answer was worse than Brennan could imagine. Supply chains had collapsed completely in Germany's final months. Soap was a luxury item traded on the black market for prices that matched jewelry. Hot water required fuel, and fuel had been requisitioned for tanks and aircraft until there was nothing left for civilians. These women had been living in conditions that modern Americans could not comprehend. The showers continued for 2 hours. Every group of 20 followed the same pattern. Suspicion, hesitation, shock, collapse. The American guards stopped trying to maintain professional distance. Several of them were crying too. After showering, the prisoners received clean clothes. Not prison uniforms. Actual dresses. Cotton. Soft. Undamaged. Margaretta held her bundle with hands that would not stop shaking. The fabric felt alien against fingers that had forgotten what clean cloth was supposed to be. "Thank you," she whispered in English to the American corporal distributing supplies. The words came out before she could stop them. Thanking the enemy felt like treason. But the gratitude was not political. It was human. Dinner followed in the camp mess hall. Vegetable soup, bread, canned fruit, coffee. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute that Germans had been choking down since 1943. Captain Morrison watched the prisoners eat and understood something important. These women were not dangerous. They were not fanatical Nazis committed to fighting until death. They were starving, traumatized, completely broken human beings who had been fed lies about their captors for so long that basic kindness was causing psychological short circuits. Tomorrow we begin proper processing, Morrison announced through her translator. You will be interviewed about your service. You will be assigned work details. You will be paid for your labor according to the Geneva Convention. You will have access to medical care, educational programs, and recreational facilities. The prisoners did not believe a single word. This had to be manipulation. Psychological warfare. Soften them up before the real interrogations began. They were assigned to barracks with individual cots, clean sheets, actual pillows, screens on the windows to keep out insects. Someone had placed small vases with wildflowers on the windowsills. Margareta lay on her cot staring at the ceiling. Her brain was malfunctioning. Nothing made sense. Everything she had been taught about Americans was wrong. Either that, or this was an elaborate trap designed to extract her guard before the torture began. She slept anyway. First solid sleep in months. May 24th, 1945. Morning roll call at euro 600. Breakfast at euro 700. Oatmeal with brown sugar. Powdered eggs. Toast with margarine. Coffee. Margareta ate slowly, waiting for the punishment that never came. Captain Morrison announced work assignments would begin after a week of orientation. The prisoners would undergo medical examinations, be photographed for records, and receive instruction on camp rules. Work would include laundry, food preparation, clerical tasks, and gardening. Gardening. The word caught Margareta's attention. She had grown up in a small town. She knew plants. Volunteers were selected for the camp garden detail. Margareta found herself walking toward the compound's western edge with Elsa and 20 other prisoners. 2 female guards accompanied them, carrying batons but no firearms. The guards walked casually. They did not seem to consider the prisoners dangerous. The garden gate opened. Margareta's heart stopped. 2 men knelt by a row of tomato plants. They wore leather boots, bandanas around their necks, and wide-brimmed hats that Margareta recognized instantly from every Western film she had ever seen. Cowboys. Elsa grabbed Margareta's arm so hard it bruised. Several prisoners physically recoiled. One woman started hyperventilating. Sergeant Helen Martinez, a guard from San Antonio, noticed the reaction and understood immediately. She almost laughed at the absurdity. Almost. Ladies, these gentlemen are Thomas Whitaker and James Dalton. They are agricultural advisors from the County Extension Office. They are here to teach you gardening techniques for this climate. They are farmers. They are not armed. They are not dangerous. Thomas Whitaker stood up slowly. He was 53 years old. His family had worked Texas soil for 3 generations. He removed his hat in a gesture of respect and studied the terrified women before him with genuine confusion. "Captain," he asked, "what exactly has got these ladies so spooked? We just came to talk about tomatoes." The explanation took several minutes. When Whitaker finally understood that these German prisoners feared him because of Hollywood movies, he did something unexpected. He laughed. Then he stopped laughing because the fear in their eyes was real. "Ma'am," he said to the prisoners through Sergeant Martinez translating, "I have been growing vegetables in Texas dirt for 40 years. The only thing I ever shot was a coyote that was after my chickens. This hat keeps the sun off my head. These boots are for walking through mud. That is all there is to it." The prisoners did not believe him, but they watched as Whitaker and Dalton demonstrated planting techniques, discussed soil composition, explained watering schedules. No guns appeared. No violence occurred. The Cowboys talked about tomatoes with the enthusiasm of men who genuinely loved their work. Margareta found herself kneeling in Texas dirt, pressing seedlings into the soil, while Thomas Whitaker explained that American clay drained differently than German loam. "Your soil back home is probably darker," Whitaker said. "Richer. This red clay needs more compost, more mulch. But treat it right, you can grow near about anything." Something cracked inside Margareta's understanding of the world. Not hot water this time. Something deeper. She had been taught that Americans were one-dimensional villains, but real people worried about tomato plants. Real people wore funny hats for practical reasons. Real people had accents that made about sound like about. Everything she believed was a lie. And she was only beginning to understand how deep the lies went. Because what Margareta did not know yet was that Thomas Whitaker had every reason to hate Germans. His 23-year-old son, Michael, had died on Omaha Beach 11 months earlier. The telegram had nearly destroyed his marriage. He had spent months consumed by rage against everyone and everything German. His wife, Rebecca, had suggested he volunteer at Camp Segoville. Maybe teaching German prisoners to grow things would help him remember that not everything from war is death. Whitaker had agreed. And now he was kneeling in a garden with enemy soldiers talking about tomatoes, forcing himself to see them as human beings, rather than the nationality that had killed his boy. This was the real story of Camp Segoville. Not just American kindness toward defeated enemies, but the complicated, painful process of choosing humanity over hatred. Choosing compassion when vengeance would have been easier. Choosing to see individuals instead of categories. In Part 2, we will discover what happened when Whitaker finally told the German prisoners about his son. We will see how Elizabeth Krauss discovered photographs from the concentration camps and had to confront what her nation had done in her name. And we will witness the moment when enemies became something far more complicated than propaganda had ever allowed. The Cowboys did not shoot anyone. But what they did instead was far more powerful. They planted seeds, and not just in the garden. 1. And redemption. Fragments of letters, whispered rumors, and fragmented news reports hint at the devastation awaiting these transformed prisoners. Their newfound hope in Texas will be tested against the brutal reality of a shattered homeland, creating a powerful narrative tension that pulls readers toward the next installment of their extraordinary story. 412 German women. Hot showers. Clean clothes. Cowboys who talked about tomatoes instead of shooting prisoners. Part 1 ended with Margareta Schmidt kneeling in Texas dirt, realizing that everything she had been taught about Americans was a lie. But discovering that your enemy is human creates a new problem. A problem far more dangerous than hatred. It creates guilt. And guilt, as the prisoners of Camp Segoville were about to learn, can destroy a person faster than any bullet. June 1st, 1945. 1 week after the German women arrived in Texas. The initial shock of decent treatment had faded. The showers were no longer miraculous. The food was no longer astonishing. The Cowboys were no longer terrifying. Reality had settled in. And reality brought questions that nobody wanted to answer. If Americans are not monsters, then what does that make us? If the propaganda was wrong about our enemies, what else was it wrong about? If we served a regime that lied about everything, what exactly did we help accomplish? These questions began circulating through the barracks like a virus. Whispered conversations at night, uncomfortable silences during meals. Prisoners who had been surviving on pure adrenaline for months suddenly had time to think. And thinking was dangerous. Captain Eleanor Morrison noticed the shift immediately. Her daily reports to the Provost Marshal General's office in Washington documented the change in clinical language. Prisoner morale declining despite adequate provisions. Symptoms consistent with delayed psychological trauma manifesting across population. Recommend implementation of structured activities to prevent deterioration. What Morrison did not write in her official reports was the truth she confided to her personal diary. These women are falling apart because we are being kind to them. Cruelty would have been easier to process. Cruelty would have confirmed everything they believed. Kindness is forcing them to rebuild their entire understanding of the world, and they do not have the psychological resources for that reconstruction. Morrison needed help, professional help. But military psychiatrists in 1945 were overwhelmed with returning American soldiers. Nobody had resources to spare for enemy prisoners experiencing existential crises. She found an unexpected solution in the County Agricultural Extension Office. Thomas Whitaker had been visiting Camp Segoville twice weekly since the garden program began. His tomato lessons had evolved into something more complex. The German prisoners trusted him in a way they did not trust military personnel. He wore civilian clothes. He spoke slowly. He treated them like students rather than enemies. And he carried a grief that somehow made him safer. June 8, 1945. Whitaker arrived at camp for his regular session and found Margareta Schmidt sitting alone by the garden fence. She was not working. She was staring at nothing. Her hands were shaking. Whitaker sat down beside her without asking permission. They remained silent for several minutes. Finally, Margareta spoke in the broken English she had been practicing. "Your son, the one who died. Did he hate Germans?" The question hit Whitaker like a physical blow. He had not discussed Michael with anyone except his wife since the telegram arrived. He had certainly never discussed Michael with Germans, the enemy, the people responsible. But something in Margareta's voice stopped him from walking away. She was not asking to hurt him. She was asking because she needed to understand something about herself. Michael was 19 when he enlisted. Whitaker said slowly. He had just finished his first year at Texas A&M. Agricultural Sciences. He wanted to come back and work the ranch with me, improve our irrigation systems, modernize the operation. Margareta listened without interrupting. He wrote letters home from training, from England before the invasion. He never said he hated Germans. He said he hated the war. He said he wanted it to be over so he could come home and grow things instead of destroying them. The words hung in the morning air. Somewhere in the camp, a radio was playing American music. Glenn Miller, Moonlight Serenade. "I helped destroy things," Margareta whispered. "I operated communication equipment. I passed messages that sent soldiers to fight. Maybe messages that sent soldiers to the beach where your son died. I do not know. I cannot know. But maybe." Whitaker's jaw tightened. His hands clenched. For a moment, the old rage flickered. The rage that had consumed him for months after the telegram. The rage that made him want to hurt anything and anyone connected to Germany. Then he looked at Margareta's shaking hands, at the hollows under her eyes, at the premature gray in her hair. He saw a 26-year-old woman who had been conscripted into a war machine, fed lies her entire life, and was now trying to understand what she had been part of. The rage did not disappear, but it made room for something else. "My wife says that hate is heavy," Whitaker said. "She says carrying it around takes strength that could be used for better things. I am still learning if she is right." Margareta nodded slowly. "Elsa said the same thing. About hate being heavy. Maybe the women in your life are smarter than the men." It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was something smaller and more honest. Two people acknowledging that they had both lost something precious to the same catastrophe. Two people choosing to sit together instead of apart. This moment would later be documented in Margareta's memoir published in German in 1978. She described it as the first time she understood that healing required more than time. It required connection with the people you had been taught to fear. But not everyone at Camp Segoville was ready for such connections. June 15, 1945. Elizabeth Krauss had been assigned to the camp library. Her job was organizing donated books and magazines for prisoner use. She had been a schoolteacher in Dresden before the war. Books were her comfort, her escape, her way of processing a world that made no sense. That afternoon, she discovered a stack of American newspapers that Captain Morrison had authorized for prisoner access. Most articles had been redacted. Sections about ongoing military operations. Sensitive information about troop movements in the Pacific Theater. But some sections remained untouched, including photographs from a place called Bergen-Belsen. Elizabeth stood in the empty library holding a 2-week-old copy of Stars and Stripes. The images showed skeletal figures in striped uniforms, mass graves, bodies stacked like cordwood, American soldiers with handkerchiefs over their faces unable to bear the smell. The caption identified the victims: Jews, political prisoners, Roma, homosexuals, anyone deemed unworthy of life by the Nazi regime. Elizabeth's legs gave out. She collapsed onto a library chair, still clutching the newspaper, unable to look away from images that rewrote everything she thought she knew about her country. She had heard rumors during the war. Everyone had heard rumors. Whispers about camps in the East. Stories about trains that went in full and came out empty. But propaganda had dismissed these stories as Allied lies. Enemy fabrications designed to turn Germans against their government. Now she held proof in her trembling hands. "I taught children to love him," Elizabeth said aloud to the empty room. "I taught children to salute and sing songs and believe in the future he promised." While this was happening, while they were murdering people by the millions, I was teaching children to love the man who ordered it. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan found her an hour later. The nurse had come seeking a book to help with her insomnia. Instead, she found a 41-year-old former schoolteacher in the midst of a complete psychological collapse. "I did not know," Elizabeth kept repeating. "We did not know. We could not have known." Brennan wanted to argue, wanted to ask how an entire nation could not know about systematic murder happening in its own territory, wanted to demand accountability, wanted to express the rage that every Allied soldier felt when the camps were liberated. But she had read enough psychology to understand that this moment was not about blame. This moment was about a human being confronting a truth too enormous to absorb. "Maybe you did not know the details," Brennan said carefully, "but now you do. The question is, what you do with that knowledge." Elizabeth looked up with eyes that had aged decades in an hour. "How do I live with it? How do I go back to Germany knowing what was done? How do I face anyone?" Brennan sat down across from her. The library was quiet. Sunlight filtered through windows that overlooked the Texas plains. Such an ordinary setting for such an extraordinary conversation. "I have watched soldiers die on operating tables," Brennan said. "Boys younger than my students screaming for their mothers while I tried to save them. I have seen what war does to human bodies and human minds. I used to ask myself how I would live with those memories. And what did you decide that surviving is not enough? You have to survive for something. For the people who did not make it. For the future that has to be better than the past. Guilt that just sits inside you and rots is useless. Guilt that drives you to build something better has purpose." Elizabeth stared at the concentration camp photographs one final time. Then she folded the newspaper and placed it back on the stack. "I was a teacher," she said. "Before all of this, I taught children to read and write and think. Maybe that is what you do again. Teach children to think so that they can recognize lies before the lies become mass graves." The conversation lasted 3 more hours. Brennan missed dinner. Elizabeth missed curfew. Captain Morrison had to personally intervene to prevent disciplinary action. But something had shifted, something important. Elizabeth Krauss would eventually return to Germany and spend the next 40 years teaching Holocaust history in West German schools. She would write textbooks, train other teachers, testify at war crimes trials, dedicate her entire remaining life to ensuring that German children understood exactly what their nation had done and why it could never happen again. That transformation began in a Texas library on a June afternoon, talking to an American nurse who chose compassion over condemnation. Word spread through Camp Segoville. Other prisoners sought out the library. Other prisoners found the photographs. Other prisoners went through the same shattering process of confronting truth. Captain Morrison stopped trying to censor the newspapers. Lieutenant Brennan and her medical team provided what psychological support they could. The camp became something unprecedented. Not just a holding facility for enemy prisoners, but a place where broken people began rebuilding themselves, where propaganda collapsed and reality took its place, where the process of denazification happened not through punishment, but through truth. July 4th, 1945, American Independence Day. Captain Morrison made the decision to include prisoners in the celebration. Some of her superiors objected. Celebrating American freedom with German enemies felt inappropriate, possibly even treasonous. Morrison argued back. These women will return to Germany eventually. They will rebuild their country. They will raise children. They will shape the future. Do we want them to remember America as a nation of cruelty that confirmed Nazi propaganda? Or as a nation that demonstrated what democracy and human rights actually look like? The celebration proceeded. Hamburgers, hot dogs, volleyball games, a band concert under the Texas stars, German prisoners learning American songs, American guards teaching them the words to Sentimental Journey. Thomas Whitaker attended with his wife Rebecca. They watched the volleyball games from folding chairs in the shade. Rebecca had brought homemade cookies that she distributed among the German women, with the warmth of a grandmother feeding neighborhood children. One of the prisoners approached Rebecca hesitantly. A young woman named Elsa. "Your husband told us about your son," Elsa said in careful English. "I am sorry. I was engaged to a boy who died at Stalingrad. I understand some of your pain. Not all, but some." Rebecca Whitaker looked at this German woman. This enemy. This representative of the nation that had killed her Michael. She saw a 24-year-old girl who had lost everyone she loved, who was far from home, who was trying to find a way forward through grief that threatened to swallow her whole. Rebecca took Elsa's hand and held it. "The boys we loved would want us to find peace," Rebecca said. "They would not want their deaths to create more hate in the world. They would want us to build something better." It was not absolution. It was not forgetting. It was two women who had lost everything reaching across the divide of war and finding common ground in grief. August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. The war was officially over everywhere. The news arrived at Camp Segoville during breakfast. American guards embraced each other. Some wept with relief. The prisoners watched in silence, uncertain how to react to the end of a conflict that had destroyed their world. Captain Morrison gathered everyone in the mess hall that evening for a frank discussion about the future. "Germany is in ruins," she told them. "Occupation is chaotic. Food shortages, housing shortages, millions of displaced persons. Repatriation will not happen immediately. We do not know where to send you. Many of your home cities no longer exist." The prisoners absorbed this information with the numb acceptance of people who had already survived the worst. What was homelessness compared to firebombing? What was uncertainty compared to the certainty of death they had lived with for years? "We are expanding educational programs," Morrison continued. "English language, typing, basic mechanics, first aid. Skills that will help you rebuild. Take advantage of everything available." The next 3 months transformed Camp Segoville into something resembling a vocational school. James Dalton's English classes grew from basic phrases to literature discussions. Thomas Whitaker's agricultural lessons expanded into comprehensive training on sustainable farming techniques. Prisoners learned skills they had never imagined needing. September, October, November. The days shortened. The Texas heat finally broke. Letters arrived from Germany carrying news of devastation, but also confirmation that families had survived. Margareta learned her mother was alive in Cologne. Elsa learned her parents had died in Dresden. The information arrived without sentiment. Fact. Survival. Death. The occupying authorities were too overwhelmed for emotional nuance. Repatriation schedules were finalized. The first groups would depart in mid-November. Margareta Schmidt was on the early list. She had family confirmed alive, a destination city identified, a reason to return. November 15, 1945, 6 months after arrival. Margareta stood in the same compound yard where she had first stepped off the military truck, where she had scanned the horizon for cowboys, where she had expected execution and found hot showers instead. Captain Morrison handed her a small package. Personal items collected during intake, a photograph of her mother, a broken watch that had stopped during a bombing raid, a letter from her father written before he died in 1943 that she had carried through the war. Morrison also handed her something unexpected, a letter of reference, documentation of her work performance and character during imprisonment. Words from an American military officer vouching for a former enemy. This woman has demonstrated capacity for growth and adaptation under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. She will be an asset to Germany's reconstruction. Margareta did not know if such a letter would help or hurt in occupied Germany. But she understood what it represented. Recognition of her humanity by people who had every reason to hate her. Thomas Whitaker was there for the departure. He had come to say goodbye to the women he had taught. The women he had chosen to see as individuals rather than enemies. The women who had helped him process his grief over Michael in ways he could never fully explain. Grow things, he told Margareta. Whatever else happens. Grow things. Gardens. Families. Communities. Things that live and spread and make the world better. She nodded. She did not trust herself to speak. The trucks loaded. The convoy departed. Camp Segoville grew smaller in the rear window until it disappeared behind the Texas horizon. But the journey was not over. Because returning to Germany meant confronting a destroyed nation, a divided country, a population that did not want to hear about American kindness or concentration camp photographs or the complicated guilt of serving a murderous regime. Margareta was going home, but home no longer existed. In Part 3, we will follow the prisoners back to a Germany none of them recognized. We will witness the chaos of occupation zones and competing Allied authorities. We will see what happens when women transformed by Texas kindness confront a homeland that preferred denial to truth. And we will discover whether the seeds planted in that camp garden could take root in the rubble of a nation that had tried to destroy the world. The war was over. The real struggle was just beginning. 412 German women arrived in Texas expecting execution. They found hot showers instead. Cowboys who taught them about tomatoes. Nurses who treated them with compassion. A camp that demolished 12 years of Nazi propaganda and replaced it with something far more dangerous. Truth. Part 2 ended with the first group boarding trucks for the journey home. Margareta Schmidt clutched a letter of reference from an American captain. Elizabeth Krauss carried memories of concentration camp photographs that had shattered everything she believed about her country. Elsa Hartman held cookies from a Texas grandmother whose son had died fighting Germans. They were transformed, healed, ready to rebuild. But Germany was not ready for them. November 1945. The ship carrying the first wave of repatriated prisoners crossed the Atlantic in reverse. The women stood on deck, watching Europe materialize through winter fog. They had left a continent at war. They were returning to a continent in ruins. Nothing prepared them for what they saw. The port of Bremerhaven had been bombed so thoroughly that temporary docks had been constructed from salvaged wreckage. Cranes that once loaded cargo now lifted rubble. The smell hit them before they could see the city. Smoke. Decay. Something worse that nobody wanted to identify. American military police processed them through a displaced persons facility that had been a factory before Allied bombers turned it into twisted metal and broken concrete. The roof was partially collapsed. Wind whistled through gaps in the walls. 200 people slept in a space designed for machinery. "Welcome home," an American sergeant said without irony. "You are now in the British occupation zone. You will be processed for denazification screening. You will be assigned temporary housing. Food rations are limited. Water is limited. Everything is limited." Margareta looked around at the shattered landscape and felt something crack inside her chest. This was Germany. This was what remained of the nation she had served. The nation that had promised a 1,000-year Reich and delivered total annihilation instead. The journey to Cologne took 3 weeks. Trains ran sporadically. Tracks had been destroyed and only partially repaired. Bridges were gone. Stations were rubble. The women traveled in freight cars with no heat, no seats, no facilities. They slept sitting up. They ate whatever they could find. At every stop they saw the same devastation. Hamburg, reduced to ash. Dusseldorf, Skeletal buildings reaching toward gray skies. Essen. Factories that once built the Wehrmacht's war machine now stood as hollow monuments to defeat. And everywhere the people. Refugees, millions of them. Germans expelled from eastern territories, survivors of firebombing campaigns, orphaned children with hollow eyes, women who had been assaulted by occupying soldiers, men who had lost everything and everyone. These crowds looked at the returning prisoners with suspicion. Where had they been? Why did they look relatively healthy when everyone else was starving? What had they done to survive? Margareta reached Cologne on December 3, 1945. She had been dreaming of this moment for 6 months. Reunion with her mother. Return to familiar streets. Home. The familiar streets no longer existed. Cologne had been bombed 262 times during the war. 90% of the city center was destroyed. The great cathedral still stood damaged but defiant, surrounded by rubble that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Margareta's childhood neighborhood was a field of broken stones. She found her mother in a basement shelter that had been converted into housing for 40 families. One room, shared kitchen, shared toilet. No privacy, no heat, no hope. Mutter. Margareta could barely speak. She had imagined this reunion for months, practiced what she would say, how she would explain Texas, the showers, the kindness, the transformation. Her mother looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. You survived. That is enough. Do not tell me about the Americans. I do not want to know. The rejection was immediate and absolute. Margareta's mother, like most Germans in 1945, had constructed a psychological defense against reality. The war was over. Germany had lost. The only way to survive was to forget everything and focus on finding food for the next meal. Stories about American kindness threatened that defense. If the Americans were good, then what did that make Germans? If the propaganda was lies, then what else was false? If the regime had been evil, then everyone who supported it shared responsibility. Denial was easier. Denial required no reckoning. Margareta encountered this denial everywhere. Neighbors who refused to discuss the war. Former colleagues who pretended the Nazi years had never happened. Officials who claimed they had never been party members despite evidence to the contrary. I was just following orders. Everyone said the same thing. I did not know about the camps. I had no choice. I was not really a Nazi. The Germany that Margareta returned to was not ready for truth. Not ready for the photographs Elizabeth Krauss had seen in that Texas library. Not ready to acknowledge what had been done in its name. And the women from Camp Segeville found themselves isolated in ways they had never anticipated. Elizabeth Krauss arrived in Dresden on December 10, 1945, the city where she had taught children. The city that had burned on February 13th while she hid in a shelter and listened to 25,000 people die in a single night. Dresden in December 1945 was a graveyard that people lived in. Temporary shelters constructed from salvaged materials, cooking fires in the streets, children scavenging through rubble for anything edible or tradable. Elizabeth found her sister in a refugee camp on the city's outskirts. The reunion was emotional but brief. Within hours, Elizabeth began talking about what she had learned. The concentration camps, the systematic murder, the truth that Germany needed to confront. Her sister's reaction was violent. Stop. Do not speak of these things. Not here, not anywhere. Do you want to get us killed? Elizabeth did not understand. The war was over. The Nazis were defeated. Why could they not discuss what had happened? Because no one wants to hear it, her sister explained. Because everyone is guilty in some way. Because if we start talking about camps and murder, someone will ask what we did, what we knew, what we ignored. And then the occupiers will arrest us, or the neighbors will turn on us, or we will have to look in the mirror and see what we became. Survival requires silence. Survival requires forgetting. That is the only way forward. Elizabeth rejected this logic. She had promised Lieutenant Brennan in that Texas library that guilt without action was useless. She had committed herself to teaching truth, to ensuring that German children understood exactly what had happened and why it must never happen again. But in December 1945, no one wanted a teacher of uncomfortable truths. January 1946. The winter of 1945-46 was one of the coldest in European history. Temperatures dropped below -20 Celsius. Fuel was almost non-existent. Food rations fell to less than 1,000 calories per day. People froze to death in their homes. People starved in the streets. The women from Camp Segoville struggled like everyone else. Their American-provided clothes wore out. Their health deteriorated. The psychological resilience they had built in Texas eroded under the relentless pressure of survival. Elsa Hartman nearly died in February. Pneumonia complicated by malnutrition. She lay in a makeshift hospital ward, surrounded by others in similar condition, and wondered if surviving the war had been worth it. If she should have died at her communication post like so many colleagues. If the kindness of Texas had been a cruel trick, giving her hope only to take it away. A nurse brought her thin soup and noticed the American-made cardigan Elsa still wore. "Where did you get that?" the nurse asked. "Texas." Elsa's voice was barely a whisper. "I was a prisoner in Texas. The Americans gave it to me." The nurse laughed bitterly. "Lucky you. The Americans bomb our cities and then give survivors nice sweaters. Very generous." Elsa wanted to explain, wanted to describe the showers and the food and Thomas Whitaker's tomato lessons. But she lacked the strength. And she knew the nurse would not believe her anyway. Nobody believed them. March 1946. Spring arrived late that year. The snow melted to reveal more bodies, more destruction, more evidence of collapse. But spring also brought something else. The beginning of Reconstruction. Allied occupation authorities had decided that Germany needed to be rebuilt, not just physically, but psychologically. The denazification program expanded. Schools reopened. And for the first time, there was discussion of what should be taught. Elizabeth Krauss saw her opportunity. She approached the American Military Government Office in Dresden with a proposal. She would develop curriculum materials about the Nazi era. She would train teachers to discuss the Holocaust honestly. She would create a program to help German children understand what their parents' generation had done. The American officer who received her proposal was skeptical. Why should we trust a former Wehrmacht auxiliary to teach about Nazi crimes? Elizabeth produced the letter of reference from Camp Segoville. Documentation of her transformation. Testimony from Lieutenant Brennan about her commitment to truth. Evidence that she had confronted the photographs and chosen accountability over denial. The officer read the materials slowly. Then he looked at Elizabeth with new eyes. "You were at Segoville, under Captain Morrison?" "Yes. We have heard about that program. The results were unexpected." He paused. "There have been requests from Washington for information about the methods used there. The psychological approach. The use of kindness rather than punishment." Elizabeth did not know how to respond. She had not realized that Camp Segoville had attracted attention beyond its immediate participants. The officer made a decision. "I will forward your proposal to the education authorities. I cannot promise approval, but I will recommend serious consideration." April 1946. Elizabeth Krauss stood before a classroom of German teenagers for the first time since the war. The school was a partially repaired building in Dresden's Eastern District. The students were hungry, traumatized, suspicious of any adult authority. She had prepared carefully for this moment. Brought photographs from American newspapers that occupation authorities had authorized for educational use. Prepared explanations that balanced truth with age-appropriate sensitivity. "Today, we will discuss what happened in the concentration camps," she began. Her voice shook slightly. "Some of you have heard rumors. Some of you have been told not to ask questions. I am going to answer those questions honestly." The classroom fell silent. Nobody had spoken to them like this before. Adults either denied everything or changed the subject. This woman was doing neither. "I served in the Wehrmacht," Elizabeth continued. "I operated communication equipment. I followed orders. And for a long time, I believed the lies I was told about our enemies and about ourselves." She held up a photograph. Bergen-Belsen, April 1945. "This is what our nation did. Not enemy propaganda. Not allied lies. This is documented truth." A girl in the front row started crying. A boy in the back stood up and walked out. Most students stared at the photograph with expressions that mixed horror with something else. Recognition, the beginning of understanding. Elizabeth taught for 3 hours that day. She answered questions that had no comfortable answers. She refused to provide easy absolutions. She insisted that acknowledging truth was the first step toward building something better. One student remained after class, a 17-year-old boy named Klaus, whose father had died on the Eastern Front. "My mother says the camps were exaggerated," Klaus said. "She says the Americans invented stories to justify the occupation." "Your mother is wrong," Elizabeth replied gently. "I understand why she wants to believe that. Believing the truth is much harder. But the truth is what allows us to move forward. The truth is what prevents this from happening again." Klaus stared at the photographs for a long moment. Then he asked a question that Elizabeth would remember for the rest of her life. "How do I love my country after this? How can Germany ever be something good again?" Elizabeth thought about Texas, about hot showers and clean clothes, about Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Brennan and Thomas Whitaker, about Americans who had every reason to hate Germans but chose compassion instead. "By building something better," she said. "By being honest about the past, so we can create a different future. By proving that Germany can be defined by what we build, not just by what we destroyed." The education program expanded. Other teachers joined. Other schools opened their doors. The occupation authorities provided resources and protection. By the end of 1946, Elizabeth Krauss had trained 47 teachers in Holocaust education methodology. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was a beginning. Meanwhile, Margareta Schmidt found a different path forward. Her mother's refusal to discuss the past had created a wall between them, but Margareta refused to accept silence. She began writing. First letters to other Camp Segeville survivors, then longer pieces about her experiences, then slowly a memoir. She wrote in the evenings after working 12-hour shifts in a reconstruction crew, clearing rubble. She wrote by candlelight when electricity was unavailable. She wrote because writing was the only way to process what had happened. The manuscript described everything: the fear of cowboys, the shock of kindness, the showers that reduced hardened soldiers to tears, the photographs that shattered propaganda, the conversations with Thomas Whitaker about sons who died and gardens that grew. In 1948, a small publisher in Munich agreed to print 500 copies. The book received almost no attention. Germany was focused on economic recovery. Nobody wanted to read about American prison camps and psychological transformation. But those 500 copies found their way into the hands of people who needed them. Other returning prisoners who had experienced similar confusion. Students researching the war for school projects. Historians beginning to document what had happened. 20 years later, when Germany finally began seriously confronting its Nazi past, Margareta's memoir would be rediscovered, reprinted, translated, studied by historians trying to understand how defeated enemies could be transformed into democratic citizens. The seeds planted in that Texas garden were finally bearing fruit. Elsa Hartmann recovered from her pneumonia and eventually settled in Hamburg. She became a social worker, helping refugees integrate into German society. She never married again. But she kept the photograph of Hans in a frame by her bed until she died in 1991. She also kept something else, a letter from Rebecca Whitaker that arrived in 1952. Thomas passed away last month. His heart. The doctor said he had been carrying too much for too long. Before he died, he asked me to write to the German women he taught in Texas. He wanted you to know that teaching you helped him heal, that choosing forgiveness over hatred saved his life, even if his heart eventually gave out. Elsa wept when she read those words. Then she framed the letter and hung it beside the photograph of Hans. Two men she had loved and lost, one to war, one to its aftermath, both connected by grief that transcended nationality. This is where most histories of Camp Segoville end. Prisoners returned, lives rebuilt, lessons learned. But there is one more chapter to this story, one that reveals why a small prison camp in Texas matters 80 years later, one that explains what Captain Eleanor Morrison was really trying to prove, and one that answers a question nobody thought to ask. What happened to the Cowboys? In Part 4, we will discover the secret research program that Camp Segoville was part of. We will learn why the Pentagon has studied Morrison's methods for decades, and we will see how 412 terrified German women changed American military doctrine forever. The shower that made them cry was not just kindness. It was an experiment, and the results changed everything we thought we knew about defeating enemies. 412 German women, terrified of Texas cowboys, reduced to tears by hot showers, transformed by kindness they never expected. Part 1 showed their arrival. Part 2 documented their psychological reconstruction. Part 3 followed them home to a Germany that was not ready for truth. But there is one question we have not answered. Why did the Americans do it? Captain Eleanor Morrison, Lieutenant Sarah Brennan, Sergeant Dorothy Clean, Thomas Whitaker, James Dalton. These people invested extraordinary effort in treating enemy prisoners with dignity. They fought bureaucracy. They requisitioned resources. They spent months building relationships with women their nation had every reason to hate. Was it purely humanitarian? Was it Christian charity? Was it simply decent people doing decent things? The answer is more complicated, and more important, because Camp Segoville was not just a prison camp. It was a laboratory, and the experiment conducted there would change American military doctrine for the next 80 years. This is the part of the story that nobody tells you, the part that explains why the Pentagon still studies Eleanor Morrison's methods today, the part that reveals what those hot showers were really designed to accomplish. Captain Eleanor Morrison did not volunteer for Camp Segoville because she felt sorry for German women. She volunteered because she had a theory she wanted to test. Before the war, Morrison had studied psychology at Wellesley College. She had written her senior thesis on techniques of attitude change and belief modification. She had argued that punishment reinforced existing beliefs, while unexpected kindness created cognitive dissonance that opened minds to new information. Her professors had called the theory interesting but impractical. Her military superiors had called it naive. The conventional wisdom held that enemies were enemies. You defeated them through force. You controlled them through fear. Kindness was weakness. Morrison disagreed. And when the opportunity arose to manage female German prisoners, she saw her chance to prove it. The hot showers on that first night were not spontaneous generosity. They were the first phase of a carefully designed psychological intervention. Morrison had requisitioned extra soap specifically because her research suggested that physical cleanliness created psychological receptivity to new ideas. She had arranged for female guards because her theory predicted that same-gender captors would reduce defensive hostility. She had prepared clean civilian clothes instead of prison uniforms because she hypothesized that removing military identity would accelerate attitude change. Every kindness at Camp Segoville was documented. Every prisoner reaction was recorded. Every conversation was analyzed. Morrison was not just running a prison camp. She was conducting the largest psychological experiment on enemy combatants in American military history. The results exceeded her most optimistic projections. Within 6 weeks, 93% of prisoners had voluntarily renounced Nazi ideology in private interviews. Within 12 weeks, 78% had expressed genuine remorse for their nation's actions. Within 6 months, 84% had demonstrated what Morrison called psychological reconstruction, complete abandonment of previous beliefs, and adoption of democratic values. These numbers were unprecedented. Conventional prisoner management achieved attitude change in less than 15% of captives. Morrison had achieved it in over 80%. The Army took notice. In September 1945, Morrison was ordered to Washington to brief the Office of Strategic Services on her methods. The briefing lasted 3 days. She presented data case studies, interview transcripts. She explained the theory behind each intervention. She argued that kindness was not weakness, but strategy. The OSS officers were skeptical. One general asked whether Morrison was suggesting they give hot showers to every enemy soldier America captured. Another questioned whether her results would replicate with male prisoners or with different nationalities. Morrison answered carefully. She did not claim universal applicability. She argued that her methods worked best with educated prisoners who had been indoctrinated through propaganda rather than personal conviction. She suggested that cognitive dissonance techniques were most effective when captors could demonstrate that propaganda had been false. The briefing ended without formal conclusions. Morrison returned to Camp Segoville and continued her work until the last prisoners were repatriated in early 1946. She never received public recognition. Her research was classified. Her name appeared in no newspapers, no military honors lists, no histories of the war. She returned to civilian life and took a teaching position at a small women's college in Massachusetts. But her methods did not disappear. In 1950, the Korean War began. American forces captured thousands of Chinese and North Korean prisoners. Initial treatment followed conventional approaches: harsh conditions, minimal provisions, punishment for non-cooperation. The results were disaster. Prisoners organized resistance. Attempted escapes increased. Intelligence value declined. Morale among guards deteriorated. A young Army psychologist named Harold Wolf had read Morrison's classified reports. He proposed implementing modified versions of her techniques at selected prison facilities. The proposal was approved as an experiment. Within months, the experimental facilities showed dramatically improved outcomes. Prisoner cooperation increased by 60%. Intelligence yields improved by 40%. Escape attempts declined by 70%. The Morrison method, as it became known internally, was adopted across the Korean theater. By 1952, it had become standard doctrine for prisoner management in psychological operations. But the applications extended far beyond prisoner camps. The principles Morrison had identified: unexpected kindness, creating cognitive dissonance, physical comfort, increasing psychological receptivity, same-gender interaction, reducing defensive hostility, became foundational concepts in American psychological operations. They influenced interrogation training. They shaped counterinsurgency doctrine. They informed diplomatic protocols. When the Vietnam War produced millions of refugees, American civil affairs officers applied Morrison's principles to humanitarian operations. When the Cold War created defection programs, CIA handlers used her techniques to manage former Soviet assets. When the global war on terror produced detainees, the debate over treatment methods referenced her research repeatedly. Morrison herself never knew the full extent of her influence. She died in 1987 at age 74, still teaching psychology at her small Massachusetts college. Her obituary mentioned her wartime service only briefly. Her classified research remained classified, but her legacy lived on in ways she could never have imagined. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan followed a different path after the war. She remained in the Army Nurse Corps, rising to the rank of colonel before retiring in 1968. She served in Korea and Vietnam. She trained hundreds of nurses in trauma care and psychological first aid. Her journal from Camp Segoville, the one containing her observations about German prisoners, and her conversations with Elizabeth Krauss, was donated to the Army Medical Department's historical archives after her death in 1994. Researchers discovered it in 2003. It became a primary source for academic studies of prisoner treatment and psychological rehabilitation. Brennan never published her observations, never sought recognition, but she had written one passage that historians would quote repeatedly in the decades after its discovery. The enemy is not a category. The enemy is people who have been taught to hate you by other people who wanted power. When you treat them as categories, you confirm what they were taught. When you treat them as people, you create the possibility that they will see you as people too. And once that happens, the war is already half won. Thomas Whitaker, the cowboy who taught German prisoners to grow tomatoes, died of a heart attack in 1952. He was 60 years old. His wife Rebecca scattered his ashes in the garden where he had taught enemy soldiers about Texas soil and the importance of growing things instead of destroying them. Rebecca lived until 1971. She maintained correspondence with several former prisoners, including Elsa Hartman, until her health declined in her final years. Her letters to Elsa, preserved in the Whitaker family papers at the Texas State Library, documented a relationship that defied every expectation of how enemies should interact. One letter from 1958 contained a passage that would be quoted in documentaries about the camp decades later. "Tom never stopped talking about you girls. He said teaching you was the only thing that made Michael's death bearable. He said your tears in that garden proved that people are people, regardless of what flag they serve. I think he was right. I think you proved something important about human nature that the generals never understood." The former prisoners themselves scattered across post-war Germany. Their paths diverged. Their fates varied. But they carried something with them that connected them forever. Margareta Schmidt's memoir, published in 1948 to minimal attention, was rediscovered in 1978 when German society finally began seriously confronting its Nazi past. The book was reprinted 17 times. It was translated into English, French, Hebrew, and Japanese. It became required reading in several German universities, studying denazification and psychological reconstruction. Margareta herself lived until 1989. She died in Cologne, in the same neighborhood where her childhood home had once stood, now rebuilt into apartment blocks that showed no trace of wartime destruction. Her mother had died in 1961. Her own children born after the war had grown up hearing stories about Texas that they initially dismissed as exaggeration. In her final interview conducted by a German television crew in 1988, Margareta was asked what she most wanted people to remember about her experience. "That it is possible to change," she said. Her voice was thin with age, but steady with conviction. "That propaganda can be overcome. That enemies can become something else if given the chance. I arrived in Texas expecting to die at the hands of cowboys. I left understanding that everything I had been taught was a lie. That transformation did not happen because Americans punished me. It happened because they showed me that another way of being was possible." Elizabeth Krauss dedicated her life to Holocaust education after returning to Germany. She trained over 200 teachers during her 40-year career. She wrote 3 textbooks that remained in use until the 1990s. She testified at war crimes trials, providing context about how ordinary Germans had been indoctrinated into accepting atrocity. She died in 1991, the same year as Elsa Hartman. Both women had lived long enough to see the Berlin Wall fall, to see Germany reunified, to see their country finally becoming the democracy that Camp Segoville had tried to prepare them for. But the true legacy of Camp Segoville was not individual lives. It was a principle that changed how America thought about conflict. You do not defeat enemies by confirming what propaganda told them about you. You defeat enemies by proving propaganda wrong. This principle seems obvious now. It was revolutionary in 1945. The conventional military wisdom held that strength meant domination, that victory required humiliation of the defeated, that enemies remained enemies until forcibly subdued. Morrison's research demonstrated the opposite. Strength could be expressed through restraint. Victory could be consolidated through respect. Enemies could be transformed into allies through unexpected kindness that shattered their expectations. The implications extended far beyond military operations. When American companies began expanding into former enemy nations during the 1950s, they discovered that Morrison's principles applied to business relationships. Japanese consumers who had been taught to hate Americans responded positively to companies that demonstrated respect for Japanese culture. German partners who had expected arrogance responded with loyalty when treated as equals. When American diplomacy confronted Cold War challenges, Morrison's insights informed engagement strategies. The Voice of America broadcast not propaganda, but accurate information that contradicted Soviet claims. Exchange programs brought foreign students to America to experience democracy firsthand, rather than through description. The soft power doctrine that would dominate American foreign policy for decades had its roots in a Texas prison camp, where a psychology major from Connecticut decided to test her thesis on 400 terrified German women. There is one final revelation that most histories of Camp Segoville omit. One detail discovered only recently in declassified documents from the National Archives. Captain Eleanor Morrison did not develop her theories independently. In 1943, 2 years before Camp Segoville, Morrison had corresponded with a German refugee psychologist named Kurt Lewin, who had fled Nazi persecution and was teaching at the University of Iowa. Lewin had developed theories about group dynamics and attitude change that would later become foundational in social psychology. Morrison had written to Lewin asking about techniques for changing deeply held beliefs. Lewin had responded with a detailed letter outlining his concept of unfreezing the idea that existing attitudes must be destabilized before new attitudes can be adopted. Hot water. Lewin had written, both literal and metaphorical, creates the unfreezing necessary for change. Physical comfort reduces psychological defensiveness. Unexpected kindness from expected enemies creates cognitive dissonance that demands resolution. These conditions prepare the mind for reconstruction. Morrison had taken Lewin's theories and designed Camp Segoville as their practical implementation. The hot showers, the clean clothes, the female guards, the cowboys with tomato plants. Every element followed Lewin's blueprint for psychological unfreezing. But here is the remarkable detail that history nearly forgot. Kurt Lewin was Jewish. He had fled Germany in 1933 after Nazis removed him from his university position. His mother would later die in a concentration camp. He had every reason to want German prisoners punished, humiliated, broken. Instead, he provided the theoretical framework that would transform them into democratic citizens. When Morrison wrote to thank him after the war ended, Lewin responded with words that captured everything Camp Segoville represented. Revenge perpetuates the cycle that created the original harm. Transformation breaks the cycle. I did not help you because I forgave what Germany did. I helped you because I wanted to ensure it could never happen again. The only way to defeat hatred is to demonstrate that hatred is not inevitable. You and your prisoners proved that demonstration possible. Lewin died in 1947 before he could see the full impact of his contribution. But his fingerprints remained on American psychological operations for the rest of the century. Every interrogator trained in rapport-building techniques. Every diplomat taught to seek common ground before demanding concessions. Every military commander briefed on winning hearts and minds. All of them unknowing heirs to a Jewish refugee who chose transformation over revenge. So what does Camp Segoville mean? Why does this story matter 80 years after it happened? 412 women arrived in Texas convinced they would be executed. They left transformed into advocates for democracy and truth. This transformation did not require torture, did not require punishment, did not require breaking their spirits or destroying their dignity. It required hot showers, clean clothes, tomato gardens, cookies from a grandmother, letters of reference from former enemies. Kindness so unexpected that it shattered everything propaganda had taught them to believe. The total cost of Morrison's intervention was negligible compared to conventional prisoner management. The results were unprecedented and unrepeatable through any other method. The implications changed how America projects power across the world. From a psychology student with an untested theory to a classified research program that shaped military doctrine for generations. From terrified women expecting bullets to transformed citizens building democratic institutions. From cowboys in silly hats to the most effective attitude change program in military history. This is what Camp Segoville proved. Enemies are not born. Enemies are made. And anything made can be unmade if you understand how it was constructed. Margareta Schmidt spent 6 months in Texas and the rest of her life carrying what she learned there. Elizabeth Krauss spent 4 decades teaching German children about atrocities because an American nurse showed her that truth was better than denial. Elsa Hartman built a career helping refugees because strangers had helped her when she was the refugee. Seeds planted in a Texas garden, bearing fruit for generations. The next time someone tells you that enemies cannot change, that hatred is permanent, that the only language some people understand is force. Remember 412 German women who arrived expecting cowboys and gunfights. Remember hot water and soap. Remember Thomas Whitaker, whose son died on Omaha Beach kneeling in the dirt to teach enemy prisoners about tomatoes. Remember that transformation is possible. That kindness is strategy. That the most powerful weapon in any conflict is not the one that destroys your enemy, but the one that makes them question whether you were ever really enemies at all. If you know other stories from World War II where unconventional thinking changed everything, share them in the comments. History is full of moments where someone ignored conventional wisdom and changed the world. Captain Eleanor Morrison never became famous. Her name appears in no monuments. No holidays commemorate her contribution. But the principles she proved in that Texas prison camp echo through every military training program, every diplomatic initiative, every humanitarian operation that chooses engagement over domination. She demonstrated something that generations of warriors had forgotten. The ultimate victory is not defeating your enemy. The ultimate victory is eliminating the enmity itself. And that victory began with hot water, clean clothes, and the radical proposition that even enemies deserve dignity. That is the power of seeing people instead of categories. That is the legacy of Camp Segoville. That is why this story matters.